All right, sweet. Old Roller Nation, welcome to the show. Grappling historian and podcaster as well, Ruan McFadden, who runs the Hero of a Thousand Holes podcast, one that I'm a big fan of. Ruan, welcome to the show.
Cool. Thank you for having me.
So, right out of the gate, I want to say something because I am a huge fan of your show, actually, and I'm really excited to get to chit chat with you. Because I'm a history nerd and also a grappling nerd, and so there's a cool interplay there with your show. But regardless of the content, your voice is just magnificent. Jealous because I just have like this dorky, gooby, but are you familiar with the American art show Bob Ross, like Mornings with Bob
Yes.
Ross?
Yeah. No, I know Bob
So,
Ross.
so your voice has a Bob Ross quality to it. Like these are very tumultuous times here in America, and when I find myself, somewhat, nervous and maybe uncomfortable, I'll throw on one of your shows, and just like the quality of your voice is like, we'll be all right. Like we'll work this out.
Yeah, it's strange because I mean, yeah, a few people have said that to me at this stage. You'd be like, hey, you've got like, the perfect. It's kind of like one of those underhanded compliments. I think like you've got a good voice for radio, you got a good face for radio, that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
you're not a
So,
great looking guy, so I'm not like
yeah,
totally.
I'll take that. I have this lamp off here that's probably making me look halfway radioactive as well. So, yeah, no, I've had a few people say that to me, which is weird because I think it's like everyone, like no one really, really likes the sound of their own voice. So I listen back to the things that I've recorded, and I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll take your word for it, I guess.
Well, that's super super duper cool. And I just wanted to say that right out of the gate because I am an admirer, first off, of your show, but you could read the phone book, and I would be like, this is a show I want to deal with. So. For those who aren't familiar with your show, like just give a quick blurb about that. Like we're gonna plug it at the end, but let people know what it's about because that's part of what I wanted to talk to you about was a little bit of grappling history as well.
Mhm. Sure. So, as you said, the name of the podcast is The Hero with a Thousand Homes, which is a name that I blatantly stole because it was very clearly inspired by that old Joseph Campbell book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. The Hero with a Thousand Faces being about comparative mythology, like classic book in the field of comparative mythology, basically analyzing how all of these, great narratives and stories from all across the world, all across human history, they tend to have a lot of very kind of commonly recognizable aspects to them. The call to adventure, the meeting of the mentor, the just the hero's journey, essentially. And all these stories that no matter if they came from, the Arctic Circle or the Amazon rainforest or Ireland or Germany or America or whatever, they are very, very recognizable because we as human beings have the same concerns about the world, about life, about death, and our stories just tend to converge on very, very similar and recognizable points. So that's kind of what I look at with a grappling focus is when you look at all of these different grappling cultures around the world, which is basically everywhere, every moderately large group of people that have ever gotten together around a campfire have grappled. I often compare grappling to language because it's two things that are guaranteed to arise. We will figure out a way to talk to each other and we'll end up figuring out some way to throw each other onto the ground. So every culture, just like they have their own stories, they have their own grappling styles. And just like many aspects of their stories are recognizable, no matter where you come from, because we're all human beings and we all have our very human way of relating to the world, which manifests in the stories we tell, our grappling styles tend to look very similar because, it's like I often say, the laws of physics don't change, the human body doesn't change. There's only so many ways you can grab each other and throw each other on the ground. So that hero, just like he appears in 1,000 or 100,000 different stories around the world, appears in 100,000 different wrestling rings around the world. So I look at that. I look at these different wrestling cultures from around the world. But what I really try and focus on is not so much purely the physical side of things, like the techniques, because that would get very boring very quickly, and it would get very repetitive very quickly, because you look at a jacket wrestling style from Japan, one from Ireland, one from Georgia. You see the same grips, you see the same trips, you see the same throws, because convergent evolution, you want to get someone down on the ground. We get to that. We find the easiest way to do that fairly quickly. So if you were to have a podcast where you looked at the techniques and the rules of grappling styles around the world, every episode would be 5 minutes long, and it would basically be 90% the same. It'd be like, hey, guess what? You grab the guy, you try and take him to the ground. That's it. There's no big surprise. So what I really try and focus on is not just the physical aspect of it, but the surrounding cultural and the historical aspects of it as well. So why do they wear this particular type of jacket, for instance? Why do they play this type of musical instrument in the background while they wrestle? Why do they do this type of a dance beforehand? Why do they call this technique that way? And that is then where the more unique aspects of that culture start to arise. Where did this people come from? What kind of challenges have they faced? What language do they speak? What kind of songs do they sing? And how does all of that feed in to their particular expression of this great human activity, wrestling? So that's what I look at.
I think first off, to me that's a fascinating concept, and I think you're dead on. I actually I listened to an interview by Dean Lister, and he was talking about humans grappling and sort of exploring the same idea. Hold on a second, my dog wants outside.
No worries.
Come on, man. He's not
priorities, man. Priorities.
He's not being polite here. Humans got to wrestle, dogs got to go poop. Exactly. But he was saying that it makes perfect sense physiologically that humans are grapplers. We have opposable thumbs. We have sort of longish arms and strong hands. If we were built like horses, like we probably would have a martial art based around biting and kicking, because horses are really good at that. So it seemed to me like a pretty good summation of why grappling always pops up in every culture. We're just built to do it. And what I like about the show too is just like what you said, is the exploration of the cultures surrounding, that sort of finite capacity. Like grappling is infinite, but it's also very finite. In the same way that boxing is 6 punches, but it's infinite, it's still 6 punches. And so the culture around those things is, shoot. Why did this stupid asshole? Sorry, I just hit the wrong button on my phone.
No worries. Yeah, videos are gone. No,
yeah,
got you back.
Yeah, I had a pop-up message. I've got my alerts off, but one slipped through there because it was a financial alert. My bank sent me something there. Anyway, sorry about that. But the culture surrounding it, that's where each individual group sort of expresses the differences that make us all different. So, like we're all the same, but we're all different. And I think your show really digs into that in a way that is really fun and fascinating. And so being obviously an American and well, maybe not obviously, I don't know, like some folks where you guys are from call us the ugly Americans. And I think I certainly fit into that. But I first learned of your show from the Globetrotters video where you were exploring collar and elbow wrestling in the jiu-jitsu setting, like in just adapting somewhat of a jiu-jitsu group of people to collar and elbow rules. And so I checked out that show and learning, about the history of collar and elbow wrestling and its proliferation into America. I kind of wanted to explore that. And then we had talked a little bit previously about the interplay of collar and elbow and catch as catch can in American folk style wrestling. And I was under the impression that there was a lot of sort of co-lineage in those. And from talking to you, that is not what your research has indicated.
Yeah, so collar and elbow is the first style that I looked at when I started that podcast about 2.5 years ago. So collar and elbow, just for anyone who doesn't know, is it's I would call it an Irish style. So it was also practiced to an extent in some parts of the UK, like Cornwall as well. But it was I would definitely be comfortable with calling it primarily an Irish style because it became the definitive framework under which wrestling matches were contested in Ireland in the 19th century. And it became known as the Irish style when it moved abroad. So it might not have been invented there, as much as you can invent a grip. But just for ease of reference, let's call it an Irish style. It moved to the US, to Canada, to Australia, to New Zealand, wherever Irish immigrants went, which is a lot of places. And it became extremely popular there as well. So I did about an hour and a half long episode on the history of collar and elbow.
Which
And
I
then,
recommend to everybody because it really was fun to listen to.
cool. Advance warning there. I am actually in the process of rewriting that, and I will be re-recording it hopefully within the next month. The reason for that, which I'll get to soon, is I've realized that some of the information that I had compiled and presented there, I'm not fully willing to stand behind anymore. So I will get to that. But basically, I released that episode about 2.5 years ago. And then Christian Graugart, who is the head of BJJ Globetrotters, we've known each other for years. I've met him at camps. He messaged me and he says, "Man, you have to teach a class on that." We're having a Globetrotters camp in Heidelberg in Germany, which is where I live. He said, "Man, you got to teach a class on that because, Christian loves weird shit. Like he loves weird shit. Like anything that'll, just make, that BJJ camp a little bit different from the other one, that'll get people talking." He was like, "Man, you got to do that." No other BJJ camp in the world, I'm sure, would entertain giving me 2 hours out of their packed schedule to teach this, old dead Irish wrestling style. But he was like, "Man, you got to do it." So I went back, did a little bit more research into the rule set and how it would have looked, and I taught a class, a real crash course, 1 hour crash course, and then we held some matches afterwards. And then after that, I continued researching, and I put together a little modern rule set for anyone who wants to try hold some matches of their own. And as that research continued, I went down this rabbit hole and I went down that rabbit hole and so on. And one incredibly enlightening slash maybe what's the word, kind of disturbing in the sense that it disturbed a lot of the assumptions that I had, was coming across the newspaper archives of first-hand accounts of collar and elbow matches from the late 18th and 19th centuries from all over the world. And when I started reading those, I very quickly started realizing that this rule set that I had put together, which was based on information from one particular book, and I'm going to get to this book pretty soon because I have a real bone to pick with this book. From reading these first-hand newspaper accounts from the 19th century, I very quickly realized that this rule set that I had put together was probably not correct. And the main aspect of that rule set that was probably not correct was the fact that I had included pins, i.e., you had to pin your opponent, shoulders to the ground, in order to win. I took that information from a book called The Magnificent Scufflers, which was published in 1959.
That's a magnificent title.
Yeah, it's a great title. Like that's why, number one, the title got me. Number two, it's very vividly written. It's very passionately written. It was written by this guy called Charles Morrow Wilson. Now, trying to find info about Wilson, he doesn't have a huge online presence because obviously, he's a fairly obscure writer from half a century ago. But he was from Arkansas, I believe. Spent some time living in Vermont. And he wrote a fairly kind of weird variety of things. Like he wrote about, U.S. foreign trade and Syria and folk tales from the Ozarks and stuff like that. And he also wrote this book, The Magnificent Scufflers, which was at least purported to be about the history of collar and elbow in the United States. And in that book, he clearly states that in order to win, you had to pin your opponent, shoulders to the ground, sometimes even 4 points, shoulders and hips to the ground for 5 seconds. So when I was putting that rule set together for Heidelberg, I was like, okay, that's pretty clear. I'm going to take that, I'm going to put it in, and thus in the bouts you will see on YouTube, everyone hits their opponent down and they're working for a pin to win. Fast forward a few months to when I start reading the newspaper accounts, first-hand newspaper accounts from all over the world of collar and elbow bouts. Not a single one of them mentions pins in any capacity at all. Mm-hmm. It was always focused around the throw. You make that guy hit the ground with what was called a flat back fall. So 4 points, you have your 2 shoulders and your hips. You needed to make 3 of those points hit the ground simultaneously. So either 2 shoulders and a hip or 2 hips and a shoulder. Basically like an ippon in modern judo. Mm-hmm. That was how matches were decided. I have compiled, I believe the current count is something like 230-ish accounts directly from the 19th century. First-hand accounts, not a single mention of pins. And with that in mind, I went back and I reread that book, The Magnificent Scufflers. And very quickly, all these inconsistencies start popping up. Not just inconsistencies between what this guy Wilson said, claimed in the 1950s, but also internally inconsistent with some of the things that he claimed in one chapter versus what he claimed in another chapter. So he says, you took your collar and elbow grips and you couldn't release them, which is true. That is 100% supported by the rule sets that I have found in old 19th century newspapers. So you could not release your grips. And then 2 pages later, he describes a bunch of techniques that he considers characteristic of collar and elbow, all of which require you to release your grips. So he starts talking about arm drags and duck unders and body locks and double legs. And at that point, I'm raising my hand saying, wait a minute, 2 pages ago, you just said you weren't allowed to release your grip. So where is this double leg all of a sudden coming from? So the inconsistencies then start becoming more and more apparent. And I think one example of just how persistent the claims in that book, and I would say the myths in that book have become, is there is one anecdote that he recounts about George Washington. And he says George Washington was a prolific collar and elbow wrestler from his school days in the Reverend James Morey's Academy in Fredericksburg. He was a champion collar and elbow wrestler up until his days as the commander of the Continental Armies, when he would be throwing younger, like guys 20 years younger than them on their heads. And that's all well and good. That's an entertaining anecdote. And you see the anecdote repeated in so many different places online nowadays. Like if you Google George Washington wrestling, you will see that anecdote repeated almost word for word in, I don't know how many blog posts or Sherdog posts, or even fairly reputable websites like the US Wrestling Hall of Fame mentions that there. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, first of all, there's one clear error in that particular anecdote. So he says George Washington attended the Reverend James Morey's Academy in Fredericksburg. He didn't. He objectively did not. Ben Franklin did. Washington did not. So already there you have an immediately verifiable error. And in the meantime, just out of interest, I have trawled my way through, I would say, 10 different biographies of George Washington. And I've searched through his papers, like his own personal writings, which you can find most of online. This is US government archives. Not a single one of those. So none of the peer-reviewed academic historical biographies, none of Washington's actual first-hand self-penned papers mention collar and elbow or wrestling in any capacity at all. So there is absolutely no historical validation for this anecdote that Wilson presented in his book. And I'm thinking, if he either made this up or just couldn't be bothered to fact check something about such a famous and well-researched public figure, i.e. an anecdote that could be so easily disproven, what else did he not fact check, or what else did he just blatantly make up? So I find myself in the past few months getting particularly annoyed by that book. Number one, because I was basically fooled by it myself, which obviously it's a little bit irritating, but also because it is the source that I can tell for so many of the misconceptions about how collar and elbow looked. So you see people repeating that, oh yeah, collar and elbow had double legs, and it had submissions, and at that point, I'm there looking at my 230 plus accounts of collar and elbow matches from the 19th century and saying, no, it didn't. It clearly didn't. There was no ground fighting at all in collar and elbow. It was an upright jacket wrestling style where you took your right hand grip on the guy's collar, left hand on the guy's elbow. He took the same on you. It was fixed hold, so you had to keep those grips. You moved each other around with your upper body. Primarily a leg-centric style. So you see it repeatedly being described as a fist fight with the feet. You're constantly probing balance, you're tapping with your toes, you're hooking with the foot, you're blocking, you're tripping. You could, of course, load them up on your hips and do a hip throw if you could maintain your grips. But once you hit that flat back fall, that was it. There was no ground fighting, and there was most definitely no submissions. But because these myths that have arisen out of this one book have proliferated, and because, I know, it's kind of like the sexy view of collar and elbow. It's like, yeah, it was no-gi, and they were just there pummeling for collar ties, and of course they had arm bars, and they had kimuras, and it was really modern. That's kind of the sexy way to look at it. The fact that it was an upright style of jacket wrestling is not as sexy. It's not as modern. You probably wouldn't see that in the UFC. It's not as maybe viscerally as appealing as BJJ or as catch wrestling or just modern submission wrestling in general. So these myths become more and more and more and more prolific. And one of them, which kind of touches on, I think the point that got me off on this big tangent, is the alleged influence that collar and elbow has had on US collegiate wrestling. And this is a claim that Charles Wilson makes repeatedly in The Magnificent Scufflers. He says US collegiate wrestling, this was now in the 1950s when he would have been writing. He was, by all accounts, a very passionate fan of wrestling, so he went to wrestling meets. He did see them firsthand. And according to him, US collegiate wrestling was almost entirely collar and elbow. So it was collar and elbow in spirit, in practice, this technique, that technique, the following technique. He credits the influx of collar and elbow into collegiate wrestling to Edward Clark Gallagher, or E.C. Gallagher, who was the head wrestling coach of Oklahoma State. By all accounts, a legendary wrestling coach, one of the innovators in modern collegiate wrestling, without a doubt. And according to Wilson, it was E.C. Gallagher who took all of this collar and elbow technique, brought it in, and essentially used that as the foundation for his collegiate wrestling system. Now, interestingly enough, when you read both of E.C. Gallagher's wrestling manuals, which he wrote himself. So there was one he wrote in, I think it was 1924. It's called Amateur Wrestling, and one a little bit later in 1939, just called Wrestling. And it's a technique manual. So there are pictures and descriptions of the techniques that he considers to be absolutely fundamental to his collegiate wrestling system. Doesn't mention collar and elbow at all. Not once. And again, that's where I would start getting suspicious. So first of all, you have this guy writing in the 1950s, Charles Wilson, who claims that collar and elbow looks a particular way. i.e., you could do it with a jacket or you could do it without a jacket. You could use double legs. You could use duck unders. You could use arm drags. You could take the guy to the ground. You had to pin the guy on the ground. This was such an influential form of wrestling that it basically formed, all the main pillars of the U.S. collegiate wrestling system that we have today. And again, I'm going back to my first-hand accounts from the 19th century, which are saying none of those things. They're saying it is a stand-up form of jacket wrestling. The jacket was a compulsory part of the style, to the extent that you would have these bouts that were basically mixed rules styles. So you would fight one round under collar and elbow rules, one round under catch-as-catch-can rules, one round under Greco-Roman, sometimes one round under back hold or side hold or something like that. And even in those mixed rules bouts, the newspaper accounts specifically mention that they put on jackets for the collar and elbow round. So a jacket was an unavoidable aspect of this style. It was a jacket wrestling style. So this doesn't conform with what Wilson claims later. Said, oh yeah, you could do it no-gi, you could just kind of get a single collar tie, you didn't even have to keep the single collar tie. That's wrong. That's not how it worked. There was no ground fighting. There were no pins, and there were definitely no submissions. So first of all, this, I would go as far as calling it a fantasy image of collar and elbow that Wilson built up. Number one, didn't exist. And number two, the man that he claims used collar and elbow as the foundation to build U.S. collegiate wrestling, E.C. Gallagher, doesn't mention it once in his 2 self-penned wrestling manuals, which, again, doesn't necessarily prove that he wasn't influenced by collar and elbow. There are indeed some, trips and aspects of leg work that he could have brought in, but the fact that he didn't mention it at all in 2 of his own wrestling manuals, I don't think you can say that he basically took collar and elbow and turned that into collegiate wrestling. Maybe he took 1 or 2 little things here and there, but it is definitely not the father of collegiate wrestling that Charles Wilson suggested it was. So that's been a big part of my research for at least the past year, is coming to terms with the fact that this one source, which I put, I think, just a little bit too much trust in at the beginning, and which has unfortunately given rise to many of these old wives' tales and pieces of gym lore that are still out there.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of coming to terms with the fact that, right, I'm now going to have to go out and try and set the record a little bit clearer. And that's why I am now in the process of rewriting this episode about collar and elbow that I released about 2.5 years ago. Because in that episode, I referred quite frequently to Charles Wilson's The Magnificent Scufflers, and I referred to this. And now that I've realized that that in all likelihood was bullshit, I don't want my podcast episode to be a further propagator of this misconception. Like, I don't want people to find it in isolation, listen to it and be like, oh yeah, okay, I guess that is how collar and elbow looked. So I want to go back, I'm going to rewrite it, and then hopefully within the next month or so, I'm just going to upload a new version. So
the question that brings me to is, obviously your podcast has demonstrated that every culture has some wrestling tradition, and given that fact, there's many wrestling traditions that culturally we could, like, I guess the word that we might use in our woke society is appropriate here in America. What is it about collar and elbow that inspired this sort of mythos of this is the origins of American wrestling, when that claim appears to be somewhat dubious? Is there something special about collar and elbow, or do you think it was just an accident of chance, or this guy is just passionately writing a book and suddenly, this sort of, web of untruths or, half truths kind of came together?
Well, first of all, in terms of how collar and elbow came to the US. It did come with wave after wave of Irish immigration. So it was very widely practiced in places like Vermont, where numbers of Irish immigrants were higher. And then it did spread and become, at one point, the most popular method for contesting wrestling matches in the entire US. So it was brought there from, let's say, the old country. And it was extremely popular. And it had a lot of very passionate adherents and promoters. So when you read these old accounts of collar and elbow matches, journalists would often write about it in very glowing terms as being scientific, very technical, very intelligent. Which, that in itself is not unique. Like, that's one thing I've often noticed while researching folk styles from around the world. There's always going to be someone who claims that their style is the most scientific and the most intelligent and, the highest and the noblest, as, not like this other wrestling style that these guys in this country do that's just kind of sloppy and animalistic. There's always someone willing to trumpet their wrestling style as the best. So collar and elbow did have a lot of very passionate promoters and adherents. It also had a lot of people who didn't find it particularly exciting. That was actually one reason why it ultimately died out, both in Ireland and the US, is that you had other newer styles like catch wrestling and Greco-Roman that basically were a little bit more engaging, a little bit more visceral, because especially when it came to catch wrestling, then you did have ground fighting and you did have submissions. It was a little bit more of a definitive way of ending a fight. So these newer, more popular grappling styles just gradually pushed collar and elbow out. But it did, in its heyday, have a lot of very passionate promoters. Even after its heyday, you had guys like Charles Wilson. So I do think that at least nowadays, when you look at some of the myths and the old wives' tales that have just very, very stubbornly taken hold about how collar and elbow looked and the influence that it had, I do think they come primarily from his book, because it is, I think, probably the most significant work that has ever been written on the subject of collar and elbow. That's one kind of a barrier I ran into quite early on when I started researching, is that there's been very little actually written about it in terms of scholarly work or books, at least. There's plenty of newspaper articles, as I've now realized, but there's no technique manuals. There are very few accounts of the history or how it was practiced.
Do you think that is that an element of Irish culture, the not writing it down but passing it along orally? And the reason that I asked that is, from Kentucky, we have bluegrass music, which is descended of Scots-Irish folk music, and primarily is passed down orally. There's not it only in the last maybe 50 years have a lot of these songs and lyrics and chord charts and things started to be transcribed. Previous to that, it was more of a you were part of the club, you were part of the culture if you knew it, and if you didn't, then you weren't, and there wasn't a way to access it except from the practitioners themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So I wouldn't even say just an Irish thing. That's quite a common feature of folk wrestling styles around the world in general, is that you tend not to find manuals.
Okay.
It's something that is practiced within the community, within families or within, groups of families. They live together, they work together, they wrestle together, and you learn actively. You learn by doing. So you wouldn't study a manual. There probably wouldn't be anything like an official school where there's set training times. It's just, you grow up, and like nowadays kids would play, football or baseball or ride their bikes. Back in the day, you get together and you wrestle. That was it. So the fact that there is no manual historically is not surprising, because wrestling manuals in general were not that common. Like, you did find some, there are medieval wrestling manuals from Germany and from other places in Central Europe where they went over, different approaches to unarmed combat and sword fighting and so on. But in general, like even nowadays, you don't really see folk wrestling manuals. Like you wouldn't see Inner Mongolian Buch manuals or Vietnamese Dao Vat manuals. It's just you get together and you wrestle and you figure it out.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, yeah, you wouldn't have guys in 18th century, 19th century Kentucky compiling manuals. It'd be, hey, let's just get together and wrestle. When you start seeing wrestling manuals, like the classic wrestling manuals, like Farmer Burns' Physical Culture or Ed Strangler Lewis, or the early judo books by Jigoro Kano and Kyuzo Mifune, you're talking late 19th, early 20th centuries. Like that's when you first start seeing proper, like we would call them modern manuals with diagrams or sometimes even black and white photos.
Yeah.
And by the time those manuals started hitting the market, collar and elbow probably had just faded a little bit too much out of the public eye.
That makes sense.
Even when you read accounts from the late 19th century, they're already talking about collar and elbow as an old time sport, or the ancient days when collar and elbow was the rule. And this is only late 19th century. It had already faded that much by then. So there probably just wasn't a market or an interest in producing a manual. And so in terms of published works on collar and elbow, there's basically none apart from the Magnificent Scufflers, which was released in 1959 by Charles Morrow Wilson. So when you search for collar and elbow, that's the first/only thing. I mean, nowadays, yeah, you might come across some of the stuff that I've put out, but definitely when I started looking for it 3-4 years ago, that was basically the only thing I found. Because you can find it online, like there's PDF versions of it on archive.org and Scribd. So you do a Google search and 30 seconds later, you've got this book. So that, I think, number one, was the only printed work on collar and elbow throughout the 20th century. And two, certainly was the most widely available one online. So I do think it is the source of so many of these misconceptions that have popped up and you can still see online today. You Google collar and elbow and you'll see Sherdog posts and blog posts that repeat almost word for word little anecdotes that Wilson included in his book. So one, I don't even think people are actively trying to misrepresent how the style looked. It's just they Google it, they find what appears to be a very reputable source of info. I mean, I considered it reputable until I started reading the primary sources that directly contradicted it. So I don't think they're actively trying to misrepresent it. They're just saying like, hey, look, I researched this old Irish wrestling style. Guess what? They had submissions and they influenced collegiate wrestling. It's just out of interest that they're doing it. So I don't think there's any, purposeful attempts to mislead anyone there. Sometimes when I point out that this most likely wasn't true, sometimes you do encounter a little bit of pushback, like a little bit of, I don't know if I like this. Because, when you tie yourself, and, there's a lot of people in the US with Irish ancestry. And it's pretty cool to be able to say that we had this old Irish wrestling style, which was immensely popular, which it was. That is true. That's unambiguously true. But to be able to say that, it influenced to this day the way that everyone in every US collegiate wrestling program competes and trains, that's pretty appealing. And to be able to say, we had ground fighting and we had submissions, it was very modern. It was cool. It's almost like BJJ. Like BJJ is the cool thing nowadays. Like if you want to try and sell your old folk wrestling style, like if you can get that BJJ angle in there, even better. So when you then raise your hand and you point out, all of these old articles that don't support any of these claims at all, and in fact outright contradict them, you do sometimes get a little bit of pushback because you're like, man, I thought our old style was cooler than that. Like I thought our old style was a little bit quote unquote better than that.
Mm-hmm.
when you tie that maybe aspect of your identity and your heritage to it. So yeah, long story short, I don't think anyone is really purposely trying to mislead the wider world. I do think it's just that they have drawn upon this one source that is quite flawed. And yeah, it's pride, maybe pride in heritage, just pride in this old style that they've found, and they want it to be maybe a little bit more, visceral and invigorating than maybe it actually was.
And something that I think of within myself, I'm not resistant to the idea that my conception of collar and elbow wrestling uh, is incorrect, or that my previous belief that um, collar and elbow, by virtue of being the wrestling art that George Washington practiced, is a part of my own lineage, and I wanted to learn about it just because that's what he did. Uh, and so I find myself resistant to it just because it takes away the chance of that cultural connection to George Washington. And like you, I've read a bunch of biographies about him. And initially, I thought of him as kind of like the pragmatic founder of the country. He was not really that deeply philosophical about the American experiment, but I was wrong about that. He was deeply philosophical. He was just quiet about it because he was also very politically pragmatic, and he didn't want to tie himself to any specific word, even if he believed it fervently, very often, because that could take away the mass appeal that he had. But he was a quiet actor, and so I wanted to have, through my own wrestling, some connection, to that great person in my history. And so it is a little bit hurtful in a way that that's not that connective tissue doesn't likely exist. But I accept as truth, the truth. If the and just as you said, his biographies and his own writings don't mention it. If he was a champion, I would think that would pop up at least once or twice. In the way that Abraham Lincoln was there's newspaper articles talking about his wrestling exploits. So I'll just move it on to my current grappling is more connected to Lincoln than it is to George Washington, and find a way to be okay with that.
Cool. Yeah, Lincoln was a catch wrestler, I think, wasn't he?
Yeah, and this kind of, as we've had this conversation, it sounds to me almost like the fellow that wrote our somewhat book may have confused some elements of catch as catch can with collar and elbow, because amateur wrestling had a lot of its origins from catch wrestling. They just took the submission holds away, quote unquote, for safety, so that amateurs could practice it. And so I almost feel like if you took collar and elbow in that book and just substituted catch as catch can, you might right the wrongs a little bit. And that's a conjecture. Obviously, I have not done the research to say that. But when we talk about submission holds, we talk about pins, we talk about all those elements of catch wrestling, and then the direct influence to American folk style, which, to my understanding, and again, I'm not a historian, I'm not a researcher, but to my understanding, American folk style wrestling had its origins in catch as catch can, just removing some of the techniques that they considered more dangerous.
Yeah, I agree. And again, I would also offer the same disclaimer. I am not a catch as catch can historian by any means, so I have not really looked at that style in any great detail because other people have. There are other people out there. There are books out there.
Yeah, and we had Jake Shannon on the show, and
Yes,
he had some great points about catch as catch can, and especially Gotcha's workouts and how they were greatly inspired by the Indian wrestlers, and I forget the name of the Indian wrestling style. But he even was talking about a lot of the conditioning workouts that those guys do have become modern yoga. Like yoga is Indian wrestling conditioning light.
Yeah, that would be Pelwani or Kushti, I think is the Indian style.
Kushti was the word that, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, you've guys like Jake Shannon. There is a guy, I believe his name is Ruslan Pashaev, who wrote a book on the history of catch / Lancashire wrestling. So I basically purposely don't look into catch because there's other people out there who are, and they do a much better job. But I basically had the exact same thought when I was reading through the Magnificent Scufflers with this newfound knowledge that the way this guy is describing collar and elbow does not hold water at all. And all of these techniques he has to it, like the double legs and the pins and the submissions, that is not how it was practiced at all. And that was the first thing that came to mind. I was like, he's talking about catch wrestling. That is catch. The ground, the prolonged groundwork, the focus on submissions. Collar and elbow didn't do that. Catch did. So if anything influenced that aspect of amateur wrestling in the US, it was almost certainly catch.
Well, I don't think that's probably going to come as a tremendous surprise to anybody who has done much research within that field of the history of American folk style and catch wrestling. It almost seems like this book that we're referencing is kind of an outlier, and there's not a lot of other references that even mention collar and elbow. It's mostly catch as catch can. So to kind of transition, first off, thanks for breaking all that down. I that's really fascinating bit of history to me, and kind of a prelude to your episode, which as soon as you get it up, we'll throw that in the show notes and the YouTube link there. But what was it that got you interested in studying and doing deep dives into wrestling cultures in different isolated sort of locales and things like that? What was the thing that kicked that off?
So I've always liked history. I like traveling, like learning about other cultures. I like maps, and I like grappling. So at one point, I combined all of that. This is now about 2.5 years ago. And I decided to make a map of folk wrestling styles around the world, just out of interest. I was like, you know what? I don't think people have any conception, or let's say most people who just train a modern style like BJJ or judo, they have no conception of just how widespread this grappling thing is. Like they probably think there's, maybe 3 or 4 styles out there and that's it. So I wanted to make this map that just gave a little hint at how widespread wrestling is and was across all of human history. So yeah, I think on that map there was 74, 76 styles, which is, a tiny proportion of the styles that are and have been practiced out there since we were busy monkeys kind of throwing each other around the campfire. But still, it was fun to make. And, I shared it, on Facebook, on Reddit. People really liked it. And at some point, I looked at that map and I saw that I had marked in for Ireland collar and elbow. So I had found that there was a historical wrestling style that had been practiced in Ireland that had since completely disappeared to the extent that basically no one had heard of it. So, I asked people involved in the grappling scene in Ireland. I asked my father, who has been heavily involved in sport for most of his life. He grew up in an Irish-speaking part of the country, so was very much in touch with like the old Irish culture. Never heard of it. It had disappeared that completely within 100 years. And I thought, man, I should really look into this more, because Number one, I am Irish, and I grapple, and I made this map. So if someone ever comes to me and they say, "Hey, tell me about that Irish style on the map. What was it like? How did it work? Where did it go?" And if I just kind of shrug my shoulders and say, "Well, nah, I don't really know. I guess you grabbed the guy's collar, an elbow. I don't know where it went. I don't know how it worked." I said, "No, okay, that I can't allow that to happen. So I'm going to look into it." And pretty quickly afterwards, I think I said, "You know what? This is pretty interesting." It was so popular both within Ireland and in the US and in Australia and in New Zealand and basically everywhere that Irish immigrants went. To have this light bulb moment where I realized, man, we had our own wrestling style that was the most popular sport in the country in the 19th century and traveled abroad and was basically the most popular sport in the country in many parts of the US. I gotta share this with people. I gotta. There's going to be a bunch of people in Ireland and people of Irish ancestry abroad who would like to know this. And I thought, how will I do it? Will I write an article? Will I make another map? Will I make a YouTube video or something? And then I just thought, no, there's too much info here. I can't condense it into a map. If I write it in an article, it's going to be, 100 pages long. No one's going to want to read that. And so, a podcast. Like podcasts are nice and easily digestible. People listen to them on the way to work, cycling to training, whatever.
And you got that voice.
And apparently, as I have now been told, I didn't realize that at the time. I was like, shit, maybe people aren't going to want to have to listen to me for 90 minutes. But I just said, no, okay, whatever, podcast. And bought a microphone on Amazon, just typed up a script, recorded it, put out that first episode, and people loved it. Like it was really, it was the perfect choice of style too. And I mean, the only reason I chose it is because it was the Irish style that I needed to kind of prove that I knew something about. But it was the perfect storm because you had everyone in Ireland was interested, plus all these people of Irish ancestry abroad, of which there are a lot, and had also never heard of it and never knew that this was such a popular sport in the US and Australia. So I've had people messaging me from all over the world saying, hey man, listen, I had an Irish grandparent. I've always wanted to learn a little bit more about that aspect of my heritage. I started BJJ last year, so I like grappling. I came across your episode, and again, just the perfect combination. This area of sport that I've just kind of thrown myself into, plus this aspect of my heritage that I've always been interested in. So it was the perfect storm of interest. And from there, I thought, well, I'm interested in all of these other styles as well. Like all of these styles on the map and all the ones that I didn't put on the map, I'm interested in learning more about those. And when I'm interested in something, I want to share it. So I put everything up for free. All the visual stuff that I found, the old books and the old diagrams, that all goes up on Instagram. Podcast episodes, all free. So I just get so engaged in learning about things that I want to take that knowledge and then share it with as many people as possible. So since then, it's been 2.5 years. It takes a long time to put an episode together because I have to do a lot of reading, sometimes in, multiple different languages. Some languages I can kind of make a little bit of I can get the gist of it. Others I have to go and hire a translator. I have to write, I write each episode word for word from scratch, because I tried one short episode way back in the beginning where I basically improvised just off bullet points, and I didn't like how it came out because there was too many ums and ohs and oohs, and I forgot things. And after that, I was like, no, okay, I'm going to write every single episode word for word, like from the ground up, which takes a lot of time because you got to write, you got to rewrite, got to record, got to edit, got to get it up there. So there are months involved. I'm not one of these people that can get an episode out every week. I would love to, but I can't. It's going to take months to put an episode together. So I've been at it now for 2.5 years. I have, I think, 10 episodes, some longer than others. But it's how it's got to be, because I'm not willing to make a compromise on quality for the sake of just kind of hammering stuff out every week. If it takes 3 months, it takes 3 months. If it takes 6 months, unfortunately, it's got to take 6 months. So yeah, if you haven't heard any episodes yet, do go and check them out. There's a little bit of a backlog there. Unfortunately, the next one is not going to be just next week. It takes time, but hopefully it's worth it.
My only piece of safety advice is don't listen to it if you're driving late at night, because Ruan's voice is so soothing that you may be putting yourself at risk of falling asleep and having an accident. And that's not to say that you're boring. It's just, like I said, these are some tumultuous times today. For anyone listening in the future, is our election day 2020. It's a crazy time, and I can definitely say that listening to your show has a calming and soothing effect. And so if you're driving late at night, that might not be the time to do that. But huge fan. My two favorite episodes are the now debunked collar and elbow episode, but that'll be fixed. It's still awesome. And the episode about the Georgian wrestlers, and I've forgotten the name of
Chidoba. It's the Georgian style.
Yeah. And being a follower of Vlad Kulikov, he has a lot of tutorials on the Georgian grip. Yep. And so I already kind of knew that there was something there, just because I like Vlad, and pretty much if Vlad says it, it's true. So if Vlad says you should explore this Georgian grip, there's probably a reason. And then to hear that episode and to dig into the cultural elements that make that wrestling what it is was really fascinating. So those are the two highlights for me. But all the episodes are really good. Something else that is kind of curious to me, given the deep dives that you've done into the culture and the history of a lot of different folk wrestling styles, how have these deep dives and just like the time spent, how has it affected your actual grappling game, or maybe something simpler like just your appreciation of the cultural heritage of what you and I both do, and all my old rollers out there are doing it too.
Yeah. So yeah, in general, one thing it has really opened my eyes to is just how absolutely universal and human an activity grappling is. And I knew that beforehand, because I was like, yeah, they do this in Senegal, and they do this in Mongolia, and they do this in Russia. But obviously, since I've really started doing those deep dives, the blank spots on the map have started filling up. And in terms of history as well, things that might not exist now, but you realize they did in the past. And, it's like I was guaranteed you had a bunch of people who got together and sat around the campfire at some point in history. They were going to figure out how to communicate with each other, and they were going to end up wrestling at some point. So it has just really hammered home how big that picture is, and how we, regardless of whether you study BJJ or judo or sambo or a folk wrestling style, just you are taking part in that great human activity that stretches back into the dawn of time. Now, in terms of how it has impacted my grappling game, actually, in one way, not that much, and in other ways, quite a lot. And what I mean by that is I've always been quite stand-up focused. I've been lucky enough to train in a little club here in Heidelberg, where we basically just have always done our own thing. And our head coach, Vinny, American guy, came from a wrestling background. So right from the beginning, we had a lot of wrestling stuff in there that many BJJ clubs, at least here in Germany, where there's not much of a wrestling scene, just wouldn't have. So we were doing a lot of stand-up, a lot of wrestling, just very, very pure wrestling drills and so on. So I've always gravitated towards the stand-up side of things. So that aspect hasn't changed, because grappling in the historical sense is very much a stand-up game. 90-95% of styles, it's you grab the guy, you get him on the ground. Sometimes you might just have to make him hit the ground. In a more minority of cases, you might then have to pin him. But this whole concept of, rolling around on the ground, for 5, 10, 15 minutes and just very methodically working for a submission is extremely rare. That is essentially 20th century development, BJJ, judo, sambo, catch wrestling, things like that, where it's very submission focused. So that aspect of my grappling game has always been there. I've always been more of a stand-up person. So I would have been perfectly happy to jump into, a foot wrestling match in Iceland or Vietnam or whatever. But where my stand-up game has changed is I have now a much greater appreciation for the jacket side of things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still probably primarily a BJJ guy. So I talk about the gi, sometimes as opposed to the jacket, but I don't like the gi. I don't like rolling with the gi. I don't like, all of this fancy lapel stuff. I don't like spider guard. I don't like collar chokes. I'm much more of a no-gi person in that regard. So I liked stand-up no-gi and I liked groundwork no-gi. This whole like collar stuff, lapel stuff was just never for me. And even though I really enjoyed stand-up wrestling and takedowns, I never liked having to incorporate the jacket into that. So if we would ever, do stand up in the jacket, I would basically ignore it. I would just go for my no-gi grips, like I'd go for, my collar ties, I'd go for my body locks, I'd go for my wrist grips, whatever. And then when Christian got in touch with me 2 years ago and said, hey man, you should come and teach a collar and elbow class at the Heidelberg camp. I was like, shit. I hate this jacket stuff. I'm no good at it. It's like I ignore it. I'll wrestle in the jacket, but I purposely never grab it. And I was like, fuck. Now I'm gonna have to engage with this. Like I'm gonna have to force myself in there and start learning how this works, because it is quite different in many regards. Like the grips are different, the kazushi is different, the little push and pull, and it is a different game.
Mm-hmm.
And initially I wasn't too happy with being forced to engage with this. Like I was like, shit, maybe I can just propagate those same old collar and elbow myths and be like, oh yeah, it was nogi. It was nogi. There was no jacket involved at all. Like you just, pummel for collar ties, you get them on the ground, you work for submissions. That was how it worked. I was, maybe 1%, 2% tempted. Like maybe I could just tell people that was how it was like as well, so that I didn't have to engage with the jacket. But I thought, no, fuck this. Like I'm being historically accurate. We're going to learn some jacket wrestling.
Sure.
So that's when I really started throwing myself into the jacket side of things. And like forcing myself to take those grips, like not just the collar and elbow grips, but like the belt grips and so on, just seeing, okay, how does this world of stand-up work? And actually shout out to Vlad Kulikov, one of my go-to sources on YouTube for any stand-up technique at all, and especially anything involving the jacket. So an incredible source of knowledge when it comes to stand-up techniques.
And just the nicest guy too. Like
yeah.
He's in my opinion, he's kind of a genius and one of those rare people who, like I said, if he says it, you can just about completely trust that it's correct. And then just the nicest guy, like doesn't hold that over. He could, but he doesn't hold that over on you at all. Was lucky enough to do an interview with him, and he was just super giving of his knowledge and his time. Talked a lot about his strength and conditioning regimen and how things have changed as he's aged, and that's a lot of what this show is about. Is how do we get the most out of this grappling adventure over time? Because like we're all aging. Even if you start at 18 and you're just 18 years old, at some point you will be an old roller if you don't quit. And so we want to roll, dangerously into, our twilight years, so to speak. And so it was fun and really informative to have him talk as someone who has trained in, both grappling and strength and conditioning, literally since he was 5 years old. Like what kind of miles does that entail? And, what do you do to accommodate that? And, how do you adjust your training over time? And he just had great insights, and I'm super grateful that we had that opportunity.
Yeah, I think I've timed it badly because I'm 35, actually had to think about that. I don't know if 2020 counts with Corona, but 35. And because I've now started engaging with the jacket a lot more, over the course of those 2 years, I've actually really come to enjoy it to the extent that I've developed a real legitimate love for judo and for sambo. So I don't look at BJJ tutorial videos anymore. Like I legitimately don't think I can remember the last time I looked at a technique video for a ground technique. It's all jacket stand-up stuff. So there's a lot of Vlad in there. Shintaro Higashi has an amazing judo channel. Neil Adams, Jimmy Pedro, like there's so much, just Travis Stevens as well, like so much like judo knowledge out there. And I'm using a lot of that to build my own collar and elbow foundation because I have to be able to demo it to people. So you take your collar grip, you take your elbow grip. It's a very leg-centric style. So it's a lot of what in judo terminology you would call ashiwaza. So a lot of foot sweeps, hooks, leg reaps, hip throws. And I have to be able to demo it. And ideally, I have to be able to demo it well and do it in a live situation, which I wasn't. Like, I never really engaged with that aspect of stand-up before because I was more of a no-gi guy. And listen, I would still say, I am, I probably know more about collar and elbow and especially the history of it than most other people, but I am by no means an expert in the physical execution of it. I'm getting there bit by bit. I'm practicing it every chance I get. But if when we get back to normal post-corona times, and a few people have expressed an interest in me coming along and just giving a little presentation, showing them how it's done, I am 100% going to raise my hand and say, listen, I am not presenting myself here as some kind of hidden collar and elbow master, coming down from the mountains of Ireland, like ready to show you all this cool ninja shit. It's like, I am going to show you the framework. This is how it is done. This is how it was done. And thus, this is how we're going to do it nowadays. But guaranteed, if you put me in against, some judoka who's been doing ashiwaza, like foot sweeps, like Vlad, since they were 5 years old, guaranteed they're going to throw me on my ass in 10 seconds. But I just want to raise the awareness. I want to raise just make people aware that we had this as a historical style. It was our own. We loved it. We were good at it. And I do think training under this framework can have a lot of very tangible benefits for your grappling in general, because it is a fixed hold style where you have to take your collar grip and your elbow grip, and then you are forced to engage your legs because you can't. Your hands are locked in place. You can't do double legs. You can't do single legs. You can't do arm drags. You can't do duck unders. You can't do body locks or suplexes. You have to engage your legs. And I think, like as you said, or as Dean mentioned, we are evolutionarily geared towards interacting with the world with our arms and with our hands. Because evolution has been quite kind to us in that regard. We have our opposable thumbs. We have these things that make it so easy to grip and to grasp and to pull and to push. And that's how we tend to wrestle naturally. We grab the head, we grab the arms. So we're very, very upper body focused. And very often the legs just become something to move around on. And you do, of course, have, judoka who specialize in ashiwaza. And, there is leg work in most stand-up grappling styles, but it's usually a supplementary aspect to this upper body work. And I think if you train something like collar and elbow, not even as your primary focus, like you could be a BJJ guy or a judo guy or a sambo guy or even an MMA guy, but if you train this occasionally and all of a sudden your upper body is taken not fully out of the picture because you can still move them around, but now you're forced to engage these tools that you've maybe neglected a bit. So it's kind of like the whole, the classic John Danaher thing, like why ignore 50% of the human body? Like why ignore 50% of your own body as well? Like work on your foot sweeps a little bit, work on your blocks, work on your hooks, work on your reaps. And that transfers very well into general stand-up grappling. Like even no-gi, if you just have a single collar tie, you can still hit those same foot sweeps. So I'm mainly just trying to raise awareness. I've come up with a modern rule set, which has now been amended to remove this pins thing that
Right.
had been in there, as a little bit of a misconception. I had planned on holding more collar and elbow bouts in Estonia earlier this year, in Heidelberg, where I live, I think the week after next, but Corona kind of put the kibosh on both of those. And now I'm planning on holding them next summer, if the world gets a little bit back to normal. I've already had people get in touch with me from Ireland saying they want to set up little clubs of their own, like maybe just within a wider BJJ club so that they can play around with it once a week. That's all I want to do. I just want to raise awareness, raise interest, kind of light that little spark. Definitely not promoting myself as, some font of secret knowledge and hidden knowledge. It's mainly just like, here is everything that I have learned. Go do something with it and have fun.
Well, there's three things that what you just said brought up in my mind. The first, in discussing what I would call a limitation, but I don't want that to be taken the wrong way. So when you have fixed grips, you are limited in your options. And from a previous study within the technology world, limitation drives innovation. So if we have unlimited options, we have almost no need to innovate within the options that we have, because we can just choose one. There's going to be a fix. But if your options are fixed, now you have to find a solution within those fixed options, which seem limited. You have to dig deeper and find something. And so I would imagine, taking, for instance, like investigating the leg reaps and the foot sweeps and all that, you're also developing a finer sense of both how to see and feel and induce, but also resist kazushi. Because if you've ever done judo with somebody who is good at foot sweeps, you will know what insecurity feels like, because you cannot trust your own feet. A good judoka can throw you at any point, but a good foot sweeper can make it where the ground doesn't even work. Like you're just like, your own feet are a liability. And so investigating that, I think, would drive your sense of that very fine detail of kazushi, of when someone is off balance and how to time their foot movements, to take advantage of that. And then the other thing, from talking to Jake about jiu-jitsu, and initially he, as a catch wrestling just diehard fan, he kind of took it personally that jiu-jitsu became so popular when he just loved this art, right? But over the course of the years and maybe even decades, it sort of he came to the realization that jiu-jitsu has been, the proliferation of jiu-jitsu has been the biggest driver of the popularity of catch wrestling. Most people who come, to his workshops or anything like that got their start in grappling from jiu-jitsu. And so they started to investigate and found that, there was something else that had, some things to offer that they wanted to explore. And so initially he felt like, this sucks. I'm, screw these Gracie guys, they're just really good marketers. And then he's like, wait a minute, they're really good marketers. Like this is building a grappling culture where, 15, 20 years ago, there might have been 500 collegiate wrestlers who grappled in America. And now there's 500 in your town, So it just completely changed the potential pool of people who were interested in catch wrestling. And so I think the same thing could be said of collar and elbow. And just like you said, there's groups of guys in Ireland and where you're at in Heidelberg and whatnot, who are interested in creating these little collar and elbow clubs within their jiu-jitsu club. And that's a fascinating thing. I think to me that's a really cool. There's a connective tissue between jiu-jitsu's willingness to explore that allows for these other. I, and when I use the word limited, I don't mean limited in quality. I mean limited in number of techniques. The exploration of a limited art can greatly drive, your skill within, a more broad art. And definitely something that, then this is the third thing. This show, a lot of it is about accepting of limits and working within them, because as we age, our bodies change. And if we pretend at my age of 40 that we're capable of the same things that we were at 20, and healing, quite frankly, recovering from the same things, then we're going to shorten the ride and really take away from our opportunity to grow within the technique. And we've had people on the show who were greatly limited, partial paralysis, complete paralysis below the, like the hip line, things like that, who, by virtue of accepting the limits within that, were then able to build a very dangerous grappling game with the tools that they had left. And so collar and elbow wrestling, to me, it works within that spirit. When you limit your options, you then drive a game that exploits those options, to its peak. And then you can take those tools that you've created within that framework and reapply them in the more broad context of a catch as catch can, or a jiu-jitsu, or a judo, or wrestling, whatever whatever art that you would choose. So I think it's a great thing to study. And just hearing from you that you've fallen in love with the jacket, my guess is that what you've fallen in love with is the limitation, which then has driven you to have to develop a more refined sense of those tiny manipulations in kazushi and in timing and things like that, which then reapply to your nogi game without doubt.
Yeah, so timing is, for me, that's the huge difference, or the most notable difference between nogi grappling and jacket grappling. So I remember recently some video popped up on my YouTube recommendations, and it was kind of a little impromptu roundtable between a bunch of MMA fighters. Those like Khabib, Henry Cejudo, I think Kayla Harrison, like Olympic gold medal judoka, was there as well. And they were talking about what's more difficult, like what's harder to do, wrestling or judo. And I think Henry, because he comes from a wrestling background, he said wrestling. Habib, he's like, yeah, wrestling's pretty tough, but like judo is classy. Judo is like for gentlemen. I mean, my main, like the thing that I would characterize as the main difference between them is wrestling for me takes more stamina and energy. So it's very difficult purely in terms of grit and cardio and will. And I mean, obviously there is a huge amount of technique involved as well, but it's
I think that really is driven also by the Dan Gable school of wrestling, mm-hmm. which is, and this comes from Gotch too. Maybe it was Billy Robinson who said conditioning is your best hold. But there is a lineage within folk style wrestling that is more interested in technique and what we might call classiness than just horsepower. And I think John Smith is kind of more of a adherent to that method. I actually like the Gable style, and I like the John Smith, both mm-hmm. of those branches. But I definitely agree that culturally, wrestling has more of an emphasis on drive and conditioning and horsepower than does judo, but not all wrestling does.
Yeah. And purely in terms of, me, down in my little kind of grappling basement here in Heidelberg, when I try and wrestle versus when I often call it jacket wrestling as opposed to judo specifically. Mm-hmm. But when you bring the jacket into it, and when you bring some of those judo concepts like kuzushi into it, for me, what becomes difficult then is not so much the, like bomb, like banging your head against the other guy horsepower thing. It's the timing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a friend of mine, Kyle, who is I believe a second dan black belt in judo, and I'm probably gonna mess up his quote here, but he put it something like, in order for judo to work, like you have to exploit these half-second windows that you need to see them coming before they exist, or you need to
Mm-hmm.
create them so that you know they're going to be there. But if you just rely on seeing them, by the time you twitch and react, it's gone.
Right.
And that's one thing that I've really noticed. Like you see an opportunity, it's like his foot's here. I'm gonna go for Kochigari or Sasai Tsurukomiyashi or something like that, but it's gone. It's gone. Like by the time you think, by the time your brain wakes up, it's gone. And that to me is that's the killer. That's the riddle that I'm working on, is that timing issue, is seeing those half-second windows, or maybe even smaller, like fraction of a second windows coming, or learning how to create them better so that I don't even have to think about it. I do this, I know that window's coming, so I just go straight into the following. So
Mm-hmm.
that, for me at least, is from my experience, the way I experience no-gi stand-up or jacketless stand-up versus jacketed is horsepower versus timing.
Mm-hmm.
And that timing aspect is something that I had previously ignored because I never engaged with the jacket. Even when I did, it was like, oh, fuck this Kazushi stuff. Like, I'm just going to double leg the guy anyway.
Yeah.
So it really has opened up a whole other little branch of the grappling world that I had sort of shied away from previously.
And I personally think that the concept of taking that timing and Kazushi and sort of chess-based approach and combining it with a horsepower-based approach, putting the two together is supercharging both. Like I was saying, if a good judoka can just about throw you at any point, but a really good foot sweeper, it just makes your brain shut off. You're just like, I can't put my feet down. I can't move my feet. And this guy's making me move my feet. Like your brain. I just played with the guy for a couple of minutes and I was like, nope, this is done. I'm not doing this no more. Because like, it's just like, oh man, I'm going to go home and have to like, kick my dog or something because this guy just, when you've been standing and walking your entire life and someone makes you insecure about that is really problematic. So I think taking that element, that timing element, and that just the insecurity that you can put in someone's mind, and then combining that with a horsepower driven approach is, that's you're talking about a pretty darn dangerous wrestler right there.
That would be my dream. Like that's my goal, is to get a guy like that and put him in a collar and elbow bout and just watch what he does. Because for the bouts we held in Heidelberg last year, it was a BJJ camp. So it was, we did have people there who had fought MMA, we had people who had done wrestling, we had people who had done judo, but it was primarily a BJJ crowd. And, I told them the rules, like you got to take your fixed grips, move each other around, try and take each other down. And you could see they all by default went back into that upper body wrestling mode where they're there like pulling and shaking, and your brain is saying like, oh, I gotta like knock this guy over somehow, and they're trying to do it with their arms, which is not going to work because they've got two hopefully well working legs that are going to keep their balance underneath them. So you have to then engage that part of your body and start working your foot sweeps, your hooks, your trips, your blocks. And unfortunately, those bouts last year, we had no one who was able to do that. Like we had no one who was able to pull that switch. So it was interesting to see, but it was very indicative of, I think, what happens when you take a modern, I call it like a modern grappler, someone who does BJJ or wrestling or MMA. You take them and their upper body framework and you put them into collar and elbow, and it was pretty predictable because I guess you can't make that switch in a 5-minute match. So my dream, like my goal, is for some bout, try and get some judoka who is very comfortable or specializes in ashiwaza. Make him or her take those grips and see what happens. And I think that's the moment when, the magic of that old wrestling framework will come alive, because that's what these guys spent decades working on. Like that was the art. It was that fist fight with the feet. And I would love to see that come to life again. And of course, like it will come to life again naturally, especially if you have newer people who start collar and elbow just out of an interest in, Irish history or reconnecting with their Irish heritage, impose this framework on them. They don't have that same upper body wrestling bias. So they will start, working with their feet more, and that style will emerge again. But I would love to take one, ideally two, like high-level judo guys who know their foot sweeps, who are comfortable with it, who can pull that switch instantly, put them in a match together and see what happens. Because I think that would be very close to what you would have seen on some world championship match back in, 1860 or the like.
I think you're probably right on that. Ruan, I think we've covered a lot of the things that I was really fascinated about and wanted to get from you, and I can't thank you enough for being able to join us. And it's interesting because this show was a bit of a departure from a lot of the things that we've explored via strength and conditioning or yoga and different things like that, of trying to find ways to increase longevity and stuff like that. But it's interesting how, like everything is different, but everything is always the same. We wind up talking about, like working within limitations via, the limiting framework of collar and elbow, and how that can be a teacher. And quite frankly, those kinds of things are things that I talk about on this show almost every episode with different people from different reasons that they would have to do that, be it aging or injury or, whatever. So it's been really pretty fun to see the parallels between the different worlds there, in talking about how limitation drives innovation. Again, like I'm always saying that. But if somebody wants to learn more about you and more about your show, where would they go to look you up?
Okay, so you can go to the main website is thousandholds.net. And up there, I have direct links to all the episodes that I've put out so far. So you can listen directly on the website there. I'm also on iTunes, on Spotify, and on Stitcher. So if you don't want to listen directly on the website, you can download an MP3 directly from there, listen to it offline. But if you're more iTunes, Spotify, you can just hit me up there. If you have Instagram, you can check me out there too. I'm also there, at 1000 Holds, and that's where I put up basically anything visual that I find. So as I'm researching an episode, if I come across any old books or maps or diagrams, photographs, videos, whatever, it all goes up on the Instagram account. So that's kind of the visual side of the research, and the podcast is obviously just the speaking side. So yeah, thousandholds.net or on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or on Instagram. And I think that's basically it. You can find me on Facebook. Feel free to add me there if you're willing to put up with a bunch of weird map and old wrestling spam like every day. Yeah. See you there.
Well, Ruan, do you have any closing thoughts just as we go? Because I've kind of driven it with questions, but is there anything that has come up that you wanted to mention before we sign off?
No, I mean, I think we covered. So no, I do really appreciate having the opportunity to vent a little bit about, I often call it like the Sherdog approach to history, which is, I heard a guy, this guy told me who heard it from this guy, heard it from this guy. And, the stories get a little bit crazy. So I do appreciate having the opportunity to vent about that. And also, I particularly like that quote of yours, was it limitation drives innovation? I haven't heard that one before. And I am going to use that whenever I'm talking about this fixed hold concept that you see in collar and elbow and some other folk wrestling styles. So no, I think we covered pretty much everything. If anyone is interested in playing around with some collar and elbow of their own, I have created a suggested rule set, which you can also find on the website at thousandholds.net. It's very short and to the point. It's, I think, 10 pages long, just basically saying this is where you take the grips, this is what you have to wear, this is how you win. So if you're interested in trying it out, go check out that rule set, play with it, in your BJJ gym, in your backyard, whatever. Let me know how it goes. Take some video, post it on Instagram, start a hashtag, just spread the word. That is my ultimate goal. Just raise awareness and hopefully just make people fall a little bit in love with this old style again. So,
well, to sign off for me, what you were saying there, I greatly appreciate that you're willing to quote me. But what I'll do is I'll look up where I got that, because I'm not the person who thought of that, and that way you can attribute it to the actual person. But this show has taught me what I sought to learn, which was how do I engage in this grappling adventure into old age. And the idea that if you accept that limitation drives innovation, and that as we age we become somewhat more limited, not as limited as we might think actually, but we become somewhat more limited, then we are driven to innovate within those limitations and we get better. It's not a weakness to be limited always. Sometimes it is a strength via that path of it driving innovation. And so this show has taught me a lot of lessons. And so I'm excited to pass them along, not only, for my own use, but for others. Like, as we age, there's a part of the male brain that's like, I can't keep up with the young guys. And the answer to that is you don't have to. You have to change and, work within the new limits. But just like if you had an injury, we talked to Sean Doherty, who was a really great catch wrestler and coach and UFC fighter. And every huge spurt and growth of his game, place where he really, really improved, came from an injury, because the injury forced him to have to adapt something, and that adaptation wound up paying dividends when he was healed and no longer had to deal with the injury. So my style of leg locks, if I could have a style, just the way that I choose to approach it, a lot of it came from him and using a hands-free style, because he had a really bad wrist injury and couldn't use his hands, but still was grappling. And so, he learned how to create breaking pressure without using his hands, which is tremendously freeing once you do have your hands back. And so I always recommend people to check that out, because he's a perfect example of how a limitation within a specific time period drove an innovation that has proliferated within his game, from that time period on.
Yeah, I haven't had any injuries to that extent yet. It's all like the
That's
little
great.
the little shitty things, like, broken fingers and so on, but nothing that has actually necessitated a game change yet. But as I said, look, we're all in this game for life, and it's coming eventually.
Well, if it does come, the thing to remember, and this show has taught me that this is not an insight that I had going in. I wanted to learn this, and it came, it came to me, is that those injuries will be great teachers. Just like putting on the jacket and limiting your options is a great teacher, so will the limitations of an injury, whether it be a short-term injury that you have to work around or a long-term injury. It will force you to get better. Well, Ruadhán, can't thank you enough for your time and your insight. This has been great fun and just a really fun and fascinating journey down some of my own pseudo history that I was, pretty certain about. But now I got to, do some relearning. So I'm going to have to be more of an Abraham Lincoln fan than a George Washington fan as we move forward.
It's doable.
Yeah. Well, have a great day and a great week, and we wish you the best. This show is definitely a fan of yours, and I'll put a link to your show and the thousandhold.net in the show description as well.
Cool. Yeah, no, thank you for having me on, and take it easy.
Have a great day, brother.